This podcast will talk about working with families who are transitioning into infancy. So when we're working with parents of infants, we want to think about the reactions of parents of infants, given this stage that they've now entered in, and they're bringing their most precious little person to you. And we want to think about the teacher roles in terms of supporting the attachment process and providing information to those parents who are, really, by all intents and purposes, negotiating this stage of figuring it out what it's going to be like with you as the child care setting, and figuring out how that's going to work as a family and what that's going to be like for their baby. So infant care, which generally begins at 6 weeks of age, most places you cannot have a child in a formal early learning setting younger than 6 weeks of age. This transition might be occurring in a child care center, a family child care, informal care, or some combination thereof. And transitioning into infant care occurs at the same time that the parents have to transition. It's not just the baby that's transitioning into child care, but it's also a huge transition for a parent, a new parent, a parent who's now got more kids than they had before, to have to return to work duties after being home for a while with baby, or having someone home. Sometimes partners will kind of trade off, like, okay, well, you're home for a certain amount of time, and then I'll be home for a certain amount of time. But in any case, the whole family has shifted. It's a cataclysmic shift in the family, and yet folks are kind of expected to return to work as though nothing cataclysmic has happened, and so that creates sort of an underlying level of stress for parents. And parents may still be recuperating physically, emotionally, psychologically from the birth of the baby, the shifts in family roles and family dynamics that occur whenever you bring a new human being into the family. So this is something that is true, we think, for all parents. I do want to take a moment and talk a little bit about working with adoptive families. About 1 million children in the United States live with adopted parents, and 2 to 4% of American families include an adopted child. It's important that you're just sort of aware of that. We don't want to always assume how families have come together. When we talk about including adoption in the curriculum, that just means that it's something that sort of exists on your horizon as a possibility, that there are books in the classroom, or that you talk about the fact that a child may be adopted. That doesn't mean that you have to explain all the ins and outs of adoption. It just means that it's not like a big secret or a taboo subject either to say, or to allow a child to say, oh, well, she was born in a different country and adopted into her family. Because children, sometimes preschoolers, will start articulating this. So anyway, in terms of ways to talk with families, I think one of the biggest mistakes is to sort of tiptoe around it and be, afraid to ask. Ways to talk with children. I think a lot of people are sort of nervous about this because they're afraid where the conversation about adoption will lead. Well, what do you mean? How does that happen? And you can keep it very simple. If it comes up, you can just keep it very simple and say, well, some children live with a different set of parents than the ones that they're born to. And if you have more questions about that, you can ask your parents, and kind of, or deflect the conversation. But children don't even really press you that much for information that they're not ready for. So you can just say, oh, some children live with different parents than they're born to. In terms of offering resources, sometimes folks might say to you, well, I'm not sure about, should I be kind of reading more about my child's culture, or are there other children in the class who are adopted? Or they just might seek out different kinds of resources for you, and you want to make sure that having the ability to look around for resources for parents is something that you develop. And indeed, when you work on the major assignment for this course that requires you to develop a resource page electronically, then that'll be a skill that you hone. You won't always have everything at the ready for every topic that any parent brings to you, but at least if you have the skill to be able to find things and give them out, then then you'll know that you can always do that whenever topics come up. Okay, other things about adoption. You should know that there are different types of adoption. Public adoption is 15% of all adoptions, and these are when folks adopt children who are placed in the child welfare system. So generally, this is resultant of abuse. In a very small percentage of cases, it can result from death of parents if the child doesn't have kind of other kin that will step in and take the child, but that's a smaller percentage. Private adoptions are 40% of all adoptions. This is where children are placed in non-relative homes through nonprofit agencies, or in some cases even just private arrangements. Kinship or step-parent is common oftentimes when there's some kind of death or tragedy in a home, incarceration, addiction, child abuse, welfare agency stepping in kind of thing. Transracial adoptions is 17% of all adoptions, and this is when children are placed with the family of a different race than the child, and that's about 17% of all adoptions. And 10% of all adoptions are where citizens of a different nation are adopted by a U.S. family. So when it comes to infancy and parents, we just want to remember that it is a big transition for folks. They are still trying to figure out how to do that, and in the cases where you've got a delivery that was, physical, a biological birth, you have parents that are oftentimes tired, and there are kind of all sorts of hormones and other challenges that are associated with that. And in the case of adoption, there are a lot of expectations of adoptive parents, and in addition to all of the financial stress and strain of adoption, which is very expensive, there are kind of a lot of assumptions that people will make about your family. For example, work settings will assume that an adoptive parent is, not as tired because you didn't go through the trauma of pregnancy or birth, and then adoptive parents have to kind of sometimes deal with those kinds of aspects that it does create a layer of stress as you are transitioning into being a new parent, to have sort of all of these other dynamics that you have to deal with from all of these other people in your life. And sleep deprivation, well, that's just universal. All parents seem to experience this, and we are not at our best when we are deprived of sleep. So when we have infant parents that are stressed out and even, cranky sometimes, try not to take it personally. It's just that it's very difficult. And the first time you do anything, it is the hardest. So when you leave that baby in that early learning setting, no matter how wonderful the early learning setting folks are, sometimes you just don't cope well or handle it very well. So it's particularly difficult with the oldest child, but not even just the oldest child. I think when parents separate from that baby, it's very difficult from the parent. Leaving a child in the morning is difficult. Babies usually cry when their primary caregiver or parent leaves them in the morning. And that's hard. No parent likes to hear that. And picking up the child can also be difficult. A lot of babies will cry when they see their parent at the end of the day, and that's really upsetting for parents. They feel like, oh gosh, but I really wanted to see you, and now why are you crying when you see me instead of being happy? But really, it's the child was holding on to that all day, and it's their way of expressing relief and release at seeing that parent. So in general, this is just to remind all of us to think about what the transitions are that folks are experiencing as they work through this infant phase.